Okay, well, good
everyone.
afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good morning. This is another episode of In Conservation With, and I am joined today by a very good friend of mine, actually, because we've known each other for a long time, Chris Watson. And Chris Watson will talk about what he does in a second. But let me just quickly also tell you that this whole program has been sponsored by Leica Nature Birding, as well as King's Place Music Foundation, with whom Chris has a relationship with.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I'm artist in residence there this year, although not really in residence there because of what's happened, of course.
Of course, yeah. So Chris will be, Chris has a relationship with them. But anyway, they are sponsoring as part of their Nature Unwrapped season, which ends at the end of the year. And also King's Place, I believe, are here as well. Hello, King's Place. Whoever it is from King's Place is here.
Oh, great.
I also have to mention that I'm doing a walk in October, and it's called Walk with the Urban Birder, and it's actually on the chat now, so you can actually find out a lot more about that if you just check out the chat. So that's the housekeeping done in terms of our situation, and I think we can actually start our conversation. So Chris, lovely to have you back. It was really interesting the last time you were here, but let me ask you, how has your sort of latter part of lockdown been? Because when I first had you on this, it was in April, I think.
Yeah. It's been great, David. I mean, like you, I was stuck. Well, not stuck. I was here in Newcastle upon Tyne. I live in the suburbs, in the northern suburbs, and we've got a decent-sized back garden. So, as you know, I spent a lot of my time really sort of tuning in and recording birdsong in my back garden. And the amazing thing is, again, I know we've had this conversation, is so many people have reported what they perceive as an increase in birdsong, but also the apparent level and vigor, really, in which birds are singing. And I was really interested in this, and actually I've done a couple of pieces about it, and there's a lot of people interested in subsequently what's happened with that, because I believe it's probably been a really good season, certainly in these latitudes. And the observation that I made, and there's no sort of science behind this, is that when I first put a microphone or a pair of microphones out in my back garden in April, the first thing I noticed was not the birds singing in our garden at about 3:45, 4 o'clock, but the fact that I could hear all the other birds in surrounding territories. So the blackbird that's chosen to nest in our garden and has had 3 fledged young recently, started to sing, and it was singing really powerfully. And I suddenly realized that one reason it might have done that is that it could hear adjacent blackbirds, whereas normally where I live in suburban Newcastle, a lot of that would have been masked by urban noise, by traffic noise, by aircraft noise. So the idea that I had was that one reason why birds were singing more vigorously, not necessarily more loudly, is that they could simply hear their rivals. And so they were responding to that. So when the blackbird in our garden was singing, it was singing with a real vigor, I think, because it could hear rival males that ordinarily it wouldn't have been able to hear. Because if I could hear them, you know how acute birds' hearing is, that could certainly hear it. And of course the females could. And one possibility of the female's hearing is that she might suddenly say, actually, I quite like the guy that's singing down at number 23, so I'm going to nip over there and mate with him as well, and expand the gene pool, which is what it's all about. So it's been a fascinating time. I mean, not just in my little back garden, but in everybody's, I think. So yeah, that's what I've been enjoying doing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to wear my lockdown glasses. Despite the fact it may look conventional, I can't see out of them. So I think what you said was really interesting at the time, because I never really considered that. And when I thought about it, I thought that sounds so logical, because, obviously the background ambience of traffic and planes and stuff no one's going to hear anything. So obviously they must be hearing so much more than what they used to.
Yeah.
And I think after you said that, I remember a couple of days later going up onto, because I'm in Extremadura in Spain, in Merida, and I remember going up onto my sunroof, my sun terrace even, and actually having, I got up there at 5 in the morning, because I left my phone overnight. Inspired by you, I left my phone out overnight to see if I can record some nocturnal noises, and all I had was a couple of insects, and that was about it. But I went up, and there was this cacophony of blackbirds. Must have been about 15 blackbirds all around me singing their hearts out, and it was like being in a jungle. It was amazing to hear that sound of, that sound ringing out there.
I think, well, the other thing about that, of course, is that I think, we tend to overlook blackbirds because they're everywhere, aren't they? I think, and like you, I've had the privilege of traveling all over, and I think they're one of the best songbirds, certainly in Europe. They're just remarkable. And because they're absolutely everywhere, they get overlooked. But this year, so many people like you have had that experience. And they're saying, I walk down the street and they can pick up 3 or 4 different males singing because they're really strong at holding the territories.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm going to say, well, I've got a recording of the one that's been singing in our back garden.
Yeah, fantastic.
And this is the first point about recording. So the first thing I'll play is the dawn chorus from our back garden, from my back garden where I live with Maggie. And so it's got a bit of everything on it, but it's got that clarity of that lockdown sound. There's very little, if any, background sound, but it's a proper dawn chorus that I recorded early in April. I'll just give that a spin.
Yeah, before you put it on, let me just say a couple of things. Firstly, there's a couple of people from the other side of the pond in the States, and
all right,
I'm sure they'll be very happy to hear a blackbird, because they're probably thinking, what about our American robin? That's kind of it's basically their version of blackbird. Yeah. So I'm sure, actually, to be honest with you, if I'm going to stick my neck out, I'd say the blackbird has a better song, but my American friends may disagree with me. And before we even put the sounds on, let me just tell people who you are, because, we're talking as if everyone knows who you are.
All right.
They should do, of course. You are a founding member of the influential Sheffield-based experimental music group called Cabaret Voltaire.
David.
Oh, my French is terrible. Voltaire. During the late 70s and 80s. And you've been developing a particular and passionate interest in recording wildlife since then. You've done a lot of TV work, including working with Sir David Attenborough, no less, as his key sound person on series including Life of Birds, which won a BAFTA for Best Factual Sound in 1986. And you just won a whole ton of awards, and you also are exhibiting pieces of your work. When I say pieces, it's soundscapes, I suppose. At various locations around not only the UK, but probably the world, but certainly the UK in my list here. So much awarded, venerable person when it comes to recording sound. You and I have worked together a few years ago when we were at Latitude, the festival. And we had I think it's your idea actually, a very interesting idea, which was the line of latitude from Wales all the way through across Britain, through the actual site of Latitude, which is in Suffolk in eastern Britain, and a sonic journey whereby at points you would play, along the journey, you'd play a sound from that particular area. So I think you started off with Manx Shearwater on the coast. Yeah, we went, throughout Britain, and I was there as your wingman, basically just, that's a robin. Oh, so that's basically how we worked together. It was a really good experience. And the other thing I want to say before you put your thing on, your recording, is that Kirsten Foster is actually going to be a year older in 2 days' time. And she's hoping that she's going to be in the Pyrenees watching rutting deer. Nice. And what I was going to ask you or talk to you about was, there's a species of bird which can be drifting over the Pyrenees that has actually turned up in the UK. Lammergeier,
yeah. In fact, the last time I was down in Pyrenees and the French side, I was on the same level as Lammergeier, but I saw today on the news, it's been on every sort of national news bulletin, that Lammergeiers there's a Lammergeier in the Peak District, a bone breaker, which is astonishing.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, especially our friends in the States, a Lammergeier is a species of vulture, but very different looking. It's massive. It's got a wedge-shaped tail, and it's got like these. The adult's got like a couple of really long moustaches. Is it moustache?
Yeah.
Long moustache. And Lammergeier means sheep slaughterer. So the other name for it is bearded vulture.
Bone breaker.
And they drop bones from very high heights to break them on the rocks. They live in mountains. So it's really fascinating that one's turned up here.
Yeah, I know, it's astonishing. I don't know if it's the first in the UK, but I've never actually heard them. So I've recorded vultures in Africa, but not nowhere in Europe, really. I mean, I've heard black vultures. Do you get them over you in your part of Spain?
Yeah, I get black vultures and griffin vultures flying over my very apartment.
Nice.
Yeah. And by the way, I made a mistake. Kirsten, even though I'm sure she'd like to celebrate her birthday in 2 days' time, is actually 2 days after my walk in October. So I hope I can see you there, Kirsten.
Yeah, October's the time for red deer down in the Pyrenees. I did a workshop there last year with Fuse Arts down in Aulus-les-Bains, and we went out. The only thing you have to be careful for, Kirsten, when you're down there is there's a lot of active shooting of red deer out there, and it doesn't seem to be as well controlled as it is over here on the States, and so you just have to be a bit careful where you go out.
Okay.
Have a great time. So garden track.
Yes.
So this is nothing. It is something special, but it's not something special to my back garden, because this was happening in suburban gardens, parks and gardens all across the UK throughout April and May and early June. Of course, the dawn chorus has gone over now, so it's not really the time for experiencing it. But I think, like I said, I've had the privilege of traveling at our latitudes, and the latitude here is 55 degrees north. We've got one of the best dawn choruses anywhere in the world, and that's to do with the latitude and the fact that the breeding season is relatively compressed, and so everything's really active from March onwards, first of all with the resident birds, and then later in March and April with all the migrants. And we do occasionally get chiff-chaff and blackcap singing in our garden. But this is what it was like at 4 o'clock in the morning in early April in my back garden. And the great advantage of this, of course, is I can put a cable out the night before, like David did with his iPhone, but run a microphone and cables back into the bedroom and lie in bed with my headphones on and make recordings like this. Okay, I'll stop that. Can you hear me? Could you hear it okay?
Yes, I'm sure. By the way, let us know if you didn't hear that by putting a cross in your sort of reaction thing as opposed to writing a note. But hopefully you all heard it. What's interesting about that, Dennis Reardon, who's in America, said that the Blackbird song is more complex than the American Robin. So yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, to hear that, you don't actually think of other places outside the UK having dawn choruses. No one ever talks about the dawn chorus anywhere but in the UK, it seems.
I think because we normally, of course, we normally regard it as being in deciduous woodland. So we're lucky in that we're on a small island here, but we do have some significant areas of deciduous woodland left. And that's where the sort of lowland dawn choruses, where we are, of course, up here, I'm quite close to the Pennines. So the second piece I did for King's Place was called Dancers in the Dark, and it was about a very different chorus with curlew and red grouse and black grouse and skylarks and redshank and meadow pipits. and golden plovers. That's very different because it's in a treeless environment, of course. So all the birds, it's an aerial chorus, if you like, because they're nearly all airborne. But with I think a lot of people, and I would imagine, I would hope that some of the people tuned into our conversation are interested in recording for themselves. And that's a very good place to start. And, you know, you don't have to get on an aeroplane and fly or go to somewhere remote. Your own back garden or an urban park or garden is an absolutely perfect place to start, because these pocket-sized habitats often have quite a high density of birds, as David well knows. One of his great skills is going into these areas and teasing out birds from places where you wouldn't normally expect them in urban environments. And certainly parks and gardens in Britain are really rich places. The only thing, as I said now, is that it's more or less gone over. And so because the birds have almost finished breeding, they're still looking after or feeding young, fledged young in particular. So their efforts are more concentrated on feeding the young rather than holding and retaining territories. Yeah. There are some that are still singing, but not as many.
Yeah. Before we carry on, actually, I just wondered if you can just briefly tell the Zoomers how you got to be where you are now in terms of your history with sound recording and your history with sound itself.
Well, I was about, I never remember exactly because I'm getting on a bit now, but when I was about 12 or 13, my parents bought me as a gift, either for my birthday or Christmas. My birthday's in November, so I can't remember which it was. A portable reel-to-reel tape recorder, a national tape recorder, which I've still got in my studio. It reminds me where I started, really. Every day I'm working there. And it had a little microphone on it, on a short cable about 1 meter long. And so I recorded everything in the house. And then where I was born and grew up in Sheffield, in South Yorkshire, we had a small back garden and we had a bird table. And I remember looking out of the kitchen window, aged 13, 14, and seeing the birds feed, but not being able to hear them. And then I suddenly realized, because this little tape recorder had batteries in it, I could take it outside. So I went out, put some bird food on the table, frightened all the birds off, fixed a microphone on this little microphone on the side of the bird table, set the recorder away and ran back inside. And eventually the blue tits and chaffinches and blackbirds and robins came back and took the food while this little recorder was running. I only had about 8 minutes of tape. This is on 1/4-inch tape. So I went back out, and I like to remember, I like to think I can remember that moment where I played this recording back and I was just transported to another world. I was taken to a place where we can never be because our behavior would affect it. And so it started me on this lifelong passion for sound recording and natural history and music as well. And this idea of using a tape recorder, as it was then, as a creative instrument, and not just for documentation, but for going out and exploring. And that's what I did. I grew up on the edge of Derbyshire, the Peak District. So I used to go out there onto the gritstone and sandstone edges and take my recorder and listen out for merlins and red grouse eventually. So it started with that, and I became interested in music and film and natural history, and sort of graduated towards this idea. I was always appalled, as I still am mostly, about the quality of wildlife film soundtracks, because they're just full of the most dreadful, inappropriate music. And so I started in the late 1980s, really, starting to work in film and television. I worked at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds film unit. I was the first ever sound recordist they had there. And we used to make films, about 3 different films a year about birds. And so I really started working professionally there, and then had friends who I worked with at the RSPB who went on to work at the BBC Natural History Unit as assistant producers and researchers, people who are now executives there, and some of them still employ me. So for what I can bring, because I've been banging on about how dreadful wildlife film soundtracks are for decades and not got very far. But there are a few people who, you know, who like to think we could do a bit better. So it's just that constant idea of getting out, recording and experiencing the natural world and listening to it and presenting it as well through my installations, which is what I like doing now, putting people where my microphone was when I made the recording.
It's funny because I remember when you told me about this last time, I recalled the time when I used to work in advertising, and the sound man was always ridiculed in a way, even though his job was, for me, one of the most, if not the most important job, really, because you need to, you know, record the sound as it was happening then. They were often ridiculed. I remember wearing, because the sound man or something was sick or something, so I had to wear I had to use the microphone and record ambient sound at this commercial in Spain for San Miguel. And we're in southern Spain there, Marbella. Not bad.
Nice job.
And I remember we were shooting the scene where this guy was dressed as a bull and he was chasing a bunch of people. And I can hear crisp packets. I was going mad. I say, "Who's eating crisps?" And then I remember listening, and suddenly I heard bee eaters calling from miles away. And I was thinking, and I was drifting, listening to the bee eaters. Wow. You just get taken into a totally different world. Do you actually view the world through your eyes or through your ears?
Well, I mean, both. You know, sort of. The main thing is we don't have earlids, so even when we're asleep, we're listening. We're very good listeners. All of us here, all of us on this session, have evolved from people who are good listeners. That's the reason we're here. 40,000 years ago, when we were all living in caves in Lascaux in France or New Mexico or Australia or somewhere in Asia, and we were all sleeping in a heap at night in our cave, and we were in a cave to avoid predators, and a saber-toothed tiger or a pack of spotted hyenas came into the cave. We are the people who've evolved from those that heard those predators approach, woke up and escaped out of the back of the cave. The people that didn't hear those predators approach reached a very swift evolutionary dead end. And they're not here to subscribe to your channel, David, at the end of this conversation. So all of us are good listeners, without a doubt. The thing is now, we're losing the ability up until lockdown because we're bombarded by noise constantly. We're going to shops, we're going to restaurants, we're bombarded by music. Everywhere we go, the increase in traffic noise, anthropogenic noise, urban noise is horrendous. It's caused some birds, like the great tit, in urban environments to raise the pitch of their song, to cut through. And birds, not all birds can do that. And the birds that can't will disappear from our towns and cities, because if you can't be heard, you can't reproduce. That's it. End of story. So it's been a sort of an issue of mine for a long time that we live in such a noisy environment. And that's been the great revelation with lockdown. People have started listening again. They've been listening to the world, tuning in and finding out what they like about it. Ordinarily, I think people, a lot of us, well, not me, but a lot of people go around with iPod earbuds in or headphones on, listening to music. But I think psychologically, one of the reasons for doing that is because we're trying to isolate ourselves from all that noise, all that crap that's going off, all that nonsense. And we need to filter out. Our ears and brains are very good at doing that. And again, that's one reason I think why we've tuned into the natural world in such a spectacular way in the last few months. Our ears and brains are very good at processing, but it's a power-hungry process like CPUs and computers. So those of us who live in urban environments, who work in noisy, open-plan offices with dreadful acoustics, modern buildings with dreadful acoustics, all the time when we're suffering under those environments, our brain is processing information simply so we can hear and communicate what we're doing throughout the day. So people go home at the end of the day tired, headache, nauseous, bad-tempered. And I'm sure some of that is this idea of sick building syndrome, is that we spend all day tuning sounds out. when we go somewhere and we can open our ears and really listen and engage with the natural world, it's such a pleasure, such a joy, and we just get more out of life. It's it's not just some artistic whim. Psychologically, we all need it. We all need to be exposed to those environments.
Going back to the cave days, is there, because I thought I've read somewhere, I don't know where I got it from, but was it not the women who were the ones that were watching out for predators? So would it then correlate that women generally have better hearing or better? I'm talking about.
David, let's not go there. We could dig ourselves into a very big hole, I think, if we sort of gender hearing like that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm interested in what you say, but I don't know what the evidence is for that. I mean, I can understand it, but I think we have to be careful organising a debate around that, I think.
Yeah, the only reason why I say that is that I've been birding with many women in my life, and
oh yeah,
women are very good at spotting things better than men, I've noticed sometimes. I mean, I can't generalize, obviously, but I just wonder whether that's an evolutionary adaptation for looking out for predators and listening for predators as the men, when that hunting came back, and
Well, yeah, I take your point. I mean, I've got a lot of good friends, female sound recorders, who are Jana Vindren in Norway and Eloise Matthew from Barcelona. And I mean, yeah, there's it's just a really interesting idea that I've not really thought about. And certainly as regards predators, the thing is about the cave thing, which is obviously a generalization, but everybody was in there together, went in there to sleep, and rather like a roost of birds, starling roost, there was safety in numbers. So you would go in and everybody would be together, as far as I know. I'm not an anthropologist. So everybody would be in the same place. So whether or not it was a certain group of people, sort of as guards or something that heard those predators approach, I don't know. I mean, you would very quickly be weeded out if you weren't a good listener, because you wouldn't survive. The only reason, one of the main reasons we use our hearing for survival these days is crossing the road, and a lot of people, don't even use it very much for that.
Yeah.
The caves were certainly acoustic hotspots. That's one of the other interesting things. People have often wondered why the cave paintings of places like Lascaux were so far inside the cave, away from natural light, that people wondered why they were in such places. And it's been, I think, discovered recently that most of those places are acoustic hotspots. And so the pictures of the animals on the wall, the bison and the buffalo and the deer that were painted in there, most of them, like the ones in Lascaux, appear to have 8 legs, as if they're running. And so the idea is that these paintings were produced by firelight in these hotspots, and then perhaps what people would do, you would look at this painting through the firelight, and people would be outside of the circle of fire, and they would drum on the walls with stones. Now, you would look at these pictures, and in the flickering light of firelight, these animals painted with 8 legs may well appear film-like to be moving, to be running. And if you then heard the sound of them running outside in the darkness, you would create what was described. There's a really good book about Space of Speak, Are You Listening? As the first ever AV installation 40,000 years ago, sound and image on a cave wall. And I can well understand that. I'm fascinated by that, because people knew the importance of listening.
Fantastic. Well, speaking of which, let's look at the instruments of listening that help us to hear more.
Yeah, so I've got a few. One of the instruments I use a lot is this. My little personal microphone, like the one you wear, David, when you're on telly and things like that. It's made to be visually unobtrusive. But it's really good because I can tell you there are much more places to put this microphone, much more interesting places other than on me or anybody else. And so I quite often use these tiny microphones, personal microphones, for getting into places like nests, like the blackbird nest I recorded 2 weeks ago before they fledged. And I waited until I wasn't going to disturb them or freak the young out. I just put this little personal microphone close to the edge of the nest so I could get the food begging calls as the adults came backwards and forwards. So it's a really useful tool because in audio terms, there's no equivalent to a telephoto or zoom lens. The best technique is to get the microphone close to the subject. And that's one of the great challenges about wildlife sound recording, birds in particular. One of the things I enjoy, that you have to use, what is it's called fieldcraft. You have to use your knowledge and experience in getting a microphone close. And it's one of the first things, if people are starting out to record, it's one of the real challenges. If you're recording a dawn chorus like the track I played, you can put a microphone out in the woods or in a tree and leave it. If you want specific songs or individual calls, then the only way is to get the microphone closer to the subject to reduce what's called the signal to ambient noise. If I speak into this microphone very closely, that's a very close perspective recording, and everybody will hear that. If I do that and speak, the quality of my voice has changed entirely because I've increased the signal to ambient noise ratio. And so that's why these are used fairly close. And so the technique of overcoming that distance is one of the great challenges in wildlife sound recording. And one of the common instruments. Have you ever used a reflector, David?
No, I haven't actually.
So this is one of the commonest instruments that wildlife sound recorders use. This is called a parabolic reflector. And this is a plastic dish, but it's with a curve in it. But it's a very special curve. It's a parabolic curve, x equals y squared. As such, as a parabolic curve, if you can put a microphone at the focal point of this dish, it concentrates sound from all angles, from the angle on axis of the dish onto the capsule of a microphone. So it reduces the background noise and it focuses the sound of an individual onto the microphone. Rather than me go on about it, I can play a recording which demonstrates it. Spin down and find it.
Whilst you're looking for it, what tips would you give people? Obviously, approaching a bird's nests is something that you have to be very careful about. And for example, during lockdown, I was quite horrified to see people putting on Twitter images of birds' nests that they found in their garden, stuffing their phones into the nest, with no regard for the adults and stuff. And obviously, maybe they didn't understand the situation. So what tips would you give someone who wants to do that?
Well, just like a rule of life, just have respect, for what's around you, for the all life around you, and have some integrity about what you do. It's of course, vital that you don't disturb birds. And approaching them at the nest or the dependent young, there's a lot of birds are protected by the Schedule 1 licensing agreement. So, but as a matter of just out of respect, I made that recording with the blackbird's nest, but I waited until a time when I waited until the adults were away and the young weren't at a stage where they jump out in fright at the nest. That's not something I'd recommend for people starting out. You make your way into this gradually, and what you need to do is gain fieldcraft, gain experience, which you know all about, which I've learned over decades on how I approach things. You can use tools like a parabolic reflector to apparently get the microphone closer, because it appears to reduce the distance, because it focuses a distant sound onto the capsule of your microphone. I'll demonstrate what it can do. This is down on the border with Brazil and Argentina, a place called Iguazu, where there's, have you been there?
No, I'd love to go.
Okay. It's where the famous sort of cave swifts are, but there's over 200 waterfalls. It's where the film The Mission was shot, right on the border with Brazil and Argentina. And even if you go into the rainforest, several kilometers, you can hear the rainforest. This is a recording I made with 2 of these little personal microphones, a stereo recording. So you can hear everything on that. It's an atmosphere. It's like my back garden, and it's the rainforest in Iguazu. You can hear the distant waterfalls. You can hear everything singing. And of course, you know, as you know, in rainforests, you see very little, but you hear everything. And the guide I was with, she told me that there was a pale-bellied thrush singing up in the canopy. And it's on that recording somewhere in the background, but it's impossible to discern from everything else. So I put these stereo microphones down and picked up my reflector, found the bird by listening. I'll just go from one to the other. So this is the end of the first recording, the stereo recording. And this is the same place with the reflector of pale-bellied thrush. That's the difference. It can, yeah. So you can isolate an individual. And this is, I mean, the interesting thing about this is there's no electronics involved. It's an acoustic device. So it's noise-free. And it's been around decades. I've seen pictures of people at Cornell University in the States using this to record birds in the 1930s. So it's an interesting thing. There's been no digital enhancements or no new improvement to reflectors apart from the materials and the microphones since they're invented. It's a super precise focusing device.
Is it powered?
Well, it isn't. You don't need power. That's the great thing. You just put a microphone, any microphone, preferably an omnidirectional one, at the focal point, and any sound that hits the dish parallel to the axis will be reflected back to that common point called the focal point. And that's where the amplification comes. It's acoustic amplification. It's like, you know, sometimes when you put your hands behind your ear, if you're trying to track a bird or localize it, it's a similar effect. So it can be a bit cumbersome and, you know, a little bit impractical, but it's perfect for recording birds, in particular, that are in treetops or in the tree canopy that you can't and will never get a microphone close to. So it's a really useful device. I should say at this point, if anybody's really interested in starting out, there's an organization, an international organization called the Wildlife Sound Recording Society. And there's about 350 members all around the world, from North America to Australia. And its aim is to promote wildlife sound recording and engage people in doing it, describe and demonstrate to people the techniques. I mean, I happen to be the president of it. So, but I would investigate the website because there's a really, really good free beginner's guide on there, which tells you in much more detail that you can study at length about the principles of recording and equipment and things like that.
Yeah, Kirsten's actually, sorry, I haven't got my glasses on, sorry, Kirsten. Just put a link up, which is great, which is quite spooky actually. She was, you were talking about it and she was probably looking at it at the same time. Claire Evans asking, is the black tape an add-on feature?
Oh, that's it's a bit like me, it's wear and tear. It's been around the world a few times. The good thing about this is it's a polycarbonate, but you can roll it up and stuff your socks and pants in there when you go away. and then it just springs back to life. It has this amazing memory. This is I have to say, it's quite an expensive one. This is made in Sweden by somebody I know called Klaus Stramberg, and it's Telinga reflectors, Telinga, and they make these. Now I like these because, like I said, you can roll it up. You can get solid ones which are much less expensive.
Yeah, because I was wondering I was going to ask you, how do you transport that? You know, having a sort of a parabolic shaped package when you go on planes.
Tell me about it. It's a nightmare. I mean, it's still worth. I mean, I love what I do, but getting there, you know, with 150 kilograms of equipment, as I often take, is an absolute nightmare. You know, because you go to an airport and you're just treated like a suspect as soon as you get there.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. It's the one part I don't enjoy. It's actually the great thing I've enjoyed about lockdown, not having to fly, you know, to just being able to record in my garden. Well,
if you ever need anyone to carry your recording equipment, I'm first in the queue. Nancy has asked, would the reflector work okay with a lapel mic?
Yes, perfectly. Yeah, that's a really good idea, Nancy. And if you're looking for a cost-effective way of doing it, there's a company in the States called and I'm not sponsored by anybody on this, called Audio. They used to be called Microphone Madness, but then I think the PR people realized it wasn't a very good tagline for a microphone company. So they're just called Audio now, but they make their own, and they're really good, cost-effective microphones. They make one set, I think it's called the BSM9, which stands for binaural stereo microphone, and you get two of these little microphones. So the good thing about that is you can use them. I sometimes put them on a coat hanger, a wire coat hanger, so you can use it as a stereo pair, or you can fit it. This is just a windshield, this black tubular thing. It's just a foam windshield, but you can put one of these little microphones on the end point, on the focal point, and it works perfectly well. That's a really good technique.
Okay.
The good thing about, sorry to interrupt, David, the good thing about using omnidirectional microphones is they're much less sensitive to handling noise and wind noise, because when you're outside in the real world, you always need windshield for microphones. However, omnidirectional capsules are less sensitive to wind noise than directional ones, which is worth considering. And they're also less sensitive to handling noise. So you couldn't do this with a cardioid microphone, a directional microphone, because you would hear a lot of handling noise. Omnidirectional microphones are much less sensitive. That's why you need these huge windshields to put directional microphones in, because they need that air gap around the capsules.
Okay. Kirsten has a question, actually. Kirsten seems quite vocal in terms of a few things about talking about parabolic reflectors. Kirsten, would you want to come and ask your question live on stage?
Okay, hello.
Hi, Kirsten.
On at the moment, but well, no, it was actually because, sorry, just silly. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Mentioned it looked like a Frappuccino lid, which made me think: could you use a Frappuccino lid? What's the minimum size? Just seal. Is that right? Yay! Hey, how did you say that? Yes, could you use a Frappuccino lid, basically?
Well, good idea, but unfortunately not. The principle of these, the most important thing is that this curve is a parabolic curve, x equals y squared. If it's not a parabola, it won't have a focal point. So, you know, you can't use something like an old-fashioned dustbin lid or a wok, for example, which some people have tried, although they're very heavy, of course. So you really do need to start with a parabolic curve. And the size of the dish determines the lowest frequency you could record. So this happens to be, whatever it is, 60, 70 centimeters across. So it's still practical. I can hold it, I can hand hold it. And it works for birdsong up until, let's say, 5 or 6 kilohertz, which covers the frequency of most birdsong, certainly passerines. And it works very well at amplifying those frequencies. It doesn't work at all for low frequencies. If you went to Amboseli in Kenya to try and record elephants or red deer in the Pyrenees, this wouldn't give you very good results because low frequencies go straight through the dish. If you want to record low frequencies, you need a very, very large diameter dish. If you want to record the frequencies of an adult male voice, then you need a dish 3 meters across. So obviously it becomes impractical. So for birdsong, high frequencies, insects, small mammals, squirrels and things, this is a perfect size. It also happens to have its focal point in a plane with the dish, which makes it very easy to put a windshield over it. So enjoy your Frappuccino, but don't try and record with it, I would say.
Sound advice. To coin a phrase. So what else have you got?
Quite often you see these things, sort of high-tech things, and you see them in windshields like this around football pitches and at sporting events. This is a gun microphone, obviously, because of its shape and size. This is a short gun microphone. And people go for these because you see these in the movies. Famously, Gene Hackman in The Conversation from the 1970s, where he records people's conversations in union. That's not quite.
This is one I got on top of a video camera I found the other day.
Well, you see the rib, you see that on the top, just show us the top. Yeah, that's just like mine. That's called an interference tube, which means the capsule of the microphone is near where you are holding it, where your fingers are. And the rest of it is a hollow tube, actually. It's a very expensive hollow tube. So the sound, put your finger on the front.
Of this?
Yeah. So the sound goes straight down the barrel of David's microphone, direct sound. So if he's pointing it at a black cap or some swifts overhead, the sound from the birds goes straight down the barrel of the microphone. But there are also reflections and reverberations which enter down the ribs along the side. Run your finger down the side.
Here?
No, where the ribs are, on the top.
Right.
Yeah. So sound not only goes down the front, it goes down the sides. And that arrives at a slightly different time from the direct sound, which goes down the front. And those sounds tend to cancel out. It's called a phase cancellation tube. And that's what makes gun microphones directional. As I said, it's not like in The Conversation. They don't amplify anything. They look good, they look high tech, but they don't amplify things like a parabolic reflector does. All they do is tend to reject sounds from the side. So if you're working out in an open environment, a reed bed or a marsh, or even in a woodland, then gun microphones work quite well. They don't work very well at all in enclosed environments because the reflections, the colorations are greater or as great as the direct sound. So, and it's still no substitute for getting your microphone closer to the subject. But they're good, but don't expect too much from them. You'll get nothing like the amplification that you get from a reflector.
What about this fashion, especially over lockdown, for nocturnal migration recording? What's the best instruments to use for that?
I mean, if you want, you know, obviously the best instrument for all these things are your ears. You know, you get out there and you listen and you get experience, and so you start to learn what you might want to record. I mean, a lot of people use these things called audio moths these days, which I don't have. Have you used them, David?
No.
Have you heard of them?
No.
It's a remote sensing device. You know, a lot of people now with nocturnal logging of migrations use, rather than stay up all night and record 12 hours a night, because the problem is then, of course, you've got to listen to it back. What people tend to do is record these sounds and then use spectral analysis to see the sound, which is a lot of what bioacousticians, people who study animal communications, use. But one of the good practical devices, which a lot of people in the Wildlife Sound Recording Society use, it's called an audio moth. It's a commercial device. It's about the size of a packet of playing cards or a packet of cigarettes or something like that. And it's got a microphone in it, and you put a micro SD card in, and it'll record for long periods. A bit like the trail cameras that people like leaving out, you know, and it can be triggered by an external sound. But the technique there is less listening to sound and more looking at it in post-production. So you do spectral analysis. Quite often when you see, and I've seen them on Twitter on people that we follow, people who said, oh, I had, I don't know, lots of things flying over my house last night, ducks and inland, you know, shearwaters and birds that you wouldn't expect in, say, an urban environment in the centre of the UK. Then they do it by looking at the spectral analysis of the sound rather than listening to it. So it's an interesting idea. It's not something I do, to be honest, but I'm aware that it's quite a popular thing to try and achieve.
I've noticed in the chat that Susie Buttress is talking quite a lot about spectrograms and sounds and stuff. Do you want to quickly tell us about your experiences, Susie?
Yeah, so I've recently been using Isotope to look at my recordings of bird song that I've been taking, and it allows you to look at the spectrogram side, you know, and it's fascinating seeing the different bird songs signatures within that. So I can pick out the wood pigeons as being a very distinctive set of signatures. And today I was looking at a tawny owl one that I'd recorded and seeing how it has a spot at different frequencies all in the same sound. So you're actually seeing a whole lot more of the song than you do just by listening and enjoying the sound of it. It's just fascinating, but I'm very early on learning about it.
Yeah, I agree, Susie. It's fascinating. Isotope's one of the best, I think. There are some free ones. Queen's University in Belfast has a bit of software, a free bit of spectral analysis software. Its name escapes me. Sonic Visualizer or something like that it's called. But if you go to Queen's University in Belfast, their website, and you can download it for free. I mean, Isotope is a really powerful tool for analysis. The other technique, and something that I'm interested in, is by changing the speed of bird song in particular, in what that reveals, because there's this interesting idea around some scientific communities at the moment about what's called temporal resolution. So, for example, we can listen to a wren, as I've been doing, recording in my back garden over the last couple of months, a European wren, troglodytes, and we describe that song, as apart from being very powerful, as very rapid. So we describe it as a blur of notes and a trill. And that's because we can't resolve the individual notes. It's believed by some bioacousticians that individual wrens temporally can resolve that information and access all the information about the bird's sexual status and where it is in its habitat and things like that. I've got a snap of that I could play if you like, David.
Oh, I'd love to hear that. Love to.
I was, so This is a song of a wren from my back garden, and wrens can produce 64 separate notes in 8 seconds. Oh, sorry, that was a half speed one. I'm going to play this one first. This is real-time wren song. It's my fault. So we get that as this huge sort of blur of information. And there's lots of information we imagine, because we don't know. We imagine there's lots of information in there. If you slow that down half, you start to hear all the individual components. And what that does, by slowing it down by half, it actually reduces the pitch by an octave. So it draws down some of the notes that are on the threshold of our frequency threshold of hearing. And so we can hear more of the information. If we do it one more time, slow it down 4 times, really get into the detail. And that's, along with spectral analysis, that's another technique, just an interesting technique for analysing sounds. And of course, what's interesting there is that it starts to sound more like tropical rainforest. And that's because birds in areas of very high density and foliage have evolved the pitch of their songs to be lower, because very high frequency songs get lost amongst dense foliage as you get in tropical rainforest. That's why it doesn't sound just strange to us, but exotic, because that's what we used to be hearing from rainforest.
Yeah.
Unlike my cuckoo clock.
It's funny because when you played it last time, it was the first time I ever heard a wren song slowed down, and I think I remember remarking to you at the time it sounded very tropical. And then I went on to extrapolate that wrens as a family, I mean, our American friends will know more than us, are actually from the Americas. Most, in fact, all species are found in America, apart from the one that we have, which I think used to be called the winter wren in America, and they may have actually split it now.
Okay.
So maybe, going back to what I said previously, maybe it's a case that the wren has sort of, because most species of wren are found in the sort of tropical areas in South America, so maybe they've radiated out from there, and the wren that we have still hails, at least its song hails from that area, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's species like the Parabolic Reflector, which I've recorded out in right up off the coast of Alaska in the Bering Sea, and of course the St Kilda wren in the UK, which I think is that separate species now because of its song.
Subspecies, apparently.
Subspecies, okay. Yeah, identified because of its. I mean, it sounds less developed, I suppose, because it's exposed to fewer wrens. Maybe that's one reason why our blackbird sounds so exotic, is that there's so much competition. They've had to develop quite elaborate songs because it's been well demonstrated. The more elaborate your song for a species, the better chance you have of reproducing.
Yeah. I mean, Claire's asking, is a wren song different in tropical rainforests? The species in tropical rainforests don't sound like the wren we have in the UK, for example. They sound like tropical birds. I mean, I was in Colombia. I was lucky enough to be in Colombia in February, listening to wood wrens of different species. And they are, you never think they were wrens. It just sounds completely and utterly tropical. I think some of the wrens I've heard in North America, maybe the house wren, and even things like Carolina wren, to me sound very different to our wren, even though they sort of have that same vociferous sort of style. It's a very different song to me. But yeah.
And then there's musician wren, of course, in the tropics. Did you hear those in Colombia?
What are they called?
Musician wren.
No.
It has one of the most astonishing songs. It's not like European wren. It sounds like an orchestral instrument being tuned. It's astonishing. I don't have an example, unfortunately. Yeah, musician wren. I don't even know if it's the same family of wrens, but
yeah,
astonishing song.
Fantastic. Well, look, we've actually been talking for an hour. Your cuckoo clock reminded me because time stood still. I need to ask you a couple of very difficult questions.
Yeah.
The first of which, and I tend to ask this of most of my guests. I just wondered, I know I've already asked you this question, you may have changed your mind, but what is your favourite bird?
Golden plover. Golden plover, certainly. I mean, and again, I've really missed hearing it this year because they come to the hills and the Pennines above where I live, and they have that most gorgeous, beautiful song and that weird moth-like flight. And I just love to hear that song sort of raining down from the sky.
I remember as a kid when I went to the library and stole a couple of books on birds. I remember reading one of them. I was about 7, talking about golden plovers and saying that the call sounds like a little boy whistling. And I was thinking, what is a little boy whistling like?
Yeah, it's the other thing. I go to Iceland most years, and it's the national bird of Iceland. I forget which cause it's Spoi. Anyway, and it's when golden plovers arrive back in Iceland in April. That's when spring officially arrives. So I've stood on the coast of Iceland and watched golden plovers arriving. I just love it. And I think because the place, you know, I love those sort of heather moorlands and the uplands. Yeah. That's something I always associate with them. And on the coast here in winter, you get great flocks of them, and they have these really strange, sort of plaintive mewing sound, a bit like large gatherings of lapwing. And just when you see the birds, they're so colourful as well. And I just love them.
And speaking of places, if you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would it be right this very second?
Right this very second?
This very second.
I would be on the Farne Islands, Northumberland, amongst the terns, the Arctic terns. It's a place I've looked out onto since lockdown, but it's still closed. It's managed by the National Trust. But the Farne Islands, the Galapagos of the North, it's sometimes described as. Have you been up there, David?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
I mean, at this time of year, when the terns are in full swing there, and there's roseate terns there, or 1 or 2 roseate terns, but mostly Arctic terns, and just being amongst those birds is, you know, you just know you're alive when you're amongst Arctic terns, mostly because they're dive bombing and drawing blood. But yeah, I love it, the farms and the sound and the sights and the smell there. Grey seals as well, that's another thing I like about being up there.
Yeah, great. Zoomers, just to let you know what's happening over the next few weeks. On Friday, we got Nick Baker, the presenter. I'm sure you all know him, at least the people in the UK, but even in people in America, he's been on a few of the National Geographic stuff as well. His name is Nick Baker, and he's interested in insects, so he'll be talking about insects. Next Monday, we got Darlene Cavalier. She's a writer, and she's written a book called The Field Guide to Citizen Science, and she'll be talking about that. On Tuesday, 21st, we have a gentleman called Lev Parikane, and he will be talking about his book, Experiencing the Natural World. Well, it's actually called Into the Tangled Bank, but he's going to be talking about how do we actually experience the natural world. And then on the 22nd, Wednesday the 22nd, the slight change of time at 10:30 in the morning, we've got a lady called Polly Morgan, who is a renowned artist. She uses dead animals in her art. She actually she has taxidermy, or she stuffs them, but she's not a taxidermist. It's really interesting what she does. So that'd be quite cool to sort of see her work. On Thursday, 23rd, we've got Robert Oates, and he's talking about getting senior birders traveling, because he's trying to encourage older people to get involved. And finally, Doug Tallamy on Monday, the 27th of July, and he'll be talking about his vision for a grassroots approach to conservation. And in between all that, I think on the 19th, this coming Sunday, possibly, you may have me talking about Extremadura. So
oh, nice.
That's what's coming up. Okay, I think at this point, I'd like to say thank you very much, Chris, for coming back again and really giving us such inspiration when it comes to recording bird sounds. We haven't even talked about, and I'm really happy actually, we haven't actually even talked about David Attenborough. We may do it in 10 minutes afterwards, but thank you very much for your time. Appreciate that.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you again, David.
And all the Zoomers out there, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you got something from this, and I also hope that we'll see you again on a future In Conservation With, sponsored by King's Place, as well as Leica Nature and Birding. And all that's left for me to say is take care of yourselves and others, and keep looking up.